big greens just don't want to fight like they used to. They don't want to upset people. They don't want to upset the apple cart. They're really unwilling to advocate in the same way that they used to. But it just feels like this fusion of state and nonprofit and media conglomerates that are pushing the narrative, they're pushing the propaganda. They make people like you and I and the views that we might have appear to be unreasonable. I think that's really disconcerting in many ways because I feel like the views that conservationists might have or those who are seeing the ecological and biodiversity crisis that we're experiencing now with clear eyes, that it's actually not unreasonable at all right now to be asking for the rest of our remaining wildlands to be protected to stave off this biodiversity crisis.
Welcome, Wild Ones. I'm Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. For this episode, our guest is Adam Bronstein. Adam is a wilderness and wildlife advocate who takes an uncompromising approach to conservation. He hosts and produces Our Public Lands, a podcast where he interviews subject matter experts and activists from across the country who are working to protect and advocate for our public lands and their wildlife, wilderness, and cultural values. Adam works as Oregon Director for Western Watersheds Project, whose mission is to protect and restore Western watersheds and wildlife from the deleterious effects of public lands, livestock, grazing. Welcome to the Green Root podcast, Adam.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, I am excited and I really appreciate you having me on your podcast. And this is certainly not a quid pro quo kind of thing. You're somebody who I definitely want to speak to about lots of issues and have spoken to you about lots of issues, but you've got a doozy that we're going to discuss today. And I think it's an important topic to discuss. And I think we're going to get all sides of this issue, but it's probably going to get a little spicy. So let me tee it up here for you. So, well, we're going to talk about the mainstream environmental movement. We're going to talk about big greens. What is the terminology for some of the larger, better funded nonprofit organizations that are very influential? So let me just start with a framing question. What are some of the positive contributions you believe that these larger organizations have made to ecological protection over the decades?
Sure. I mean, big greens have all had their roots in the grassroots, right? Originally, they were founded by people who cared very much about a particular issue. And then they evolved, they went through transformations, larger forces started, coming into play. Maybe there were some funders who wanted to see certain things happen, or they started accepting foundation money or government contracts. So it's sort of this progression, and maybe it's just the natural order or the natural state of things. When organizations get started, they start small, and then they eventually get bigger, more influential, embedded into the system. But what are some good things that these organizations have done in the past? I mean, you could look at any one of them essentially. I mean, the Wilderness Society earlier in their day, they were uncompromising champions of wilderness protection. They saw the influence of the automobile and how everybody wanted to drive everywhere. The American Automobile Association was pushing really hard to cut into roadless lands to allow access. So the automobile was really this catalyst for the Wilderness Society to get going, and they saw that roadless lands and primitive areas, as they were called, were basically becoming more and more rare. And Bob Marshall, one of the founders, actually talked about wilderness as being a minority right, and he fought for wilderness kind of through that frame. The Sierra Club, John Muir founded the Sierra Club, And he was also seeing ecological issues in the Sierra Nevada, logging, livestock grazing, road building. He saw the loss of wilderness there. Um, that organization evolved. They started, fighting for against dam projects, and the Nature Conservancy. They started out against livestock grazing on public lands, for instance, and then they were buying up properties and trying to get permits retired. So groups have a long history, and what they've started out doing initially isn't necessarily what they're doing today. So in a lot of cases, they have the beneficiary of an inherited reputation, I would say, and they're continuing on in their messaging and kind of on the front end as if they're doing similar or the same thing. So it can be very confusing and confounding to people.
Sure, that's a real helpful history. So, could you give any examples of the current day where they are still doing some things that are very useful? For instance, is not pushing back against the rescinding of the roadless rule, which has protected, if imperfectly, 60 million acres of public lands for quite some time. So they're opposing the Trump administration rolling that back. So that's a positive thing, is it not?
Well, it most certainly is on its face. These groups do claim, and I do. I certainly think that they do care about this roadless rule rescission. There's no question about that. But it starts getting really messy when you look at the past legislation that many of these groups have supported and continue to support. They they support releases of wilderness study areas and roadless lands. And what a release means basically is you're taking the statutory protections and you're rolling them back. So for a wilderness study area, an area that's supposed to be managed for its wilderness characteristics until such a time that Congress decides otherwise, aka a release. You're seeing these bills come together with the support of big green organizations. So when I hear big greens coming out in support of the roadless rule, on one hand, I am happy and glad that they're doing this. But on the other hand, it feels a little duplicitous because behind the scenes, they're actually chopping up these areas and using them as part of their horse trading deals. And this has been going on for many, many decades.
Okay, fair enough. And so when we're talking about these mainstream greens, of course, we're acknowledging that the individuals affiliated with it, say for the most part, are doing things in good faith. Maybe they have a different view of strategy, but we're not suggesting that amongst actual environmental groups that they are plants from the industry who are trying to destroy public lands while pretending otherwise, right?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there's a bit of a revolving door in Washington and the big greens. I mean, what's kind of interesting is Tracy Stone Manning, who was the director of the Bureau of Land Management, is now the president of the Wilderness Society, for instance. That's kind of interesting. There's also a big revolving door in the Nature Conservancy, and also I believe NRDC. There's some revolving door stuff going on there too. So, I'm it's becoming more and more difficult to really disentangle the extractive industry with the land management agencies. I mean, it's always been the case that they've been very pro extraction, but you see this pattern of this revolving door, in and out of these organizations. And yes, of course, there are people in these organizations that care deeply about our wildlands, but I feel like they find themselves embedded in a system. And maybe it's just like going into Congress all bright eyed and bushy tailed, thinking you're going to make all this change. And then all of a sudden you get kind of rolled over and steamrolled by the system. So it's really tricky. It's hard to disentangle. There's a lot of intricacies here and nuances. And yeah, you can't just say like big green bad or big green good. It's very, very complicated.
Okay, so I wanted to front load this because I'm going to stop playing the Pollyanna in a moment here. But I wanted to do, credit where credit's due. We have to acknowledge the good with the bad. I do want to say that I don't consider the Nature Conservancy to be an environmental group anymore. So I would say that they're worth separating in a discussion from, say, a Sierra Club and NRDC.
Fair
Those
enough.
organizations have policies that I might disagree with. The Nature Conservancy is literally logging public lands. So I think at this point, even though they do some conservation efforts, they also are literally doing extraction, and that just puts them in a separate category. I think there's something, I think discussions around the Nature Conservancy are important, and I understand why people conflate the two. But I guess in my mind, I don't even think they count. But of course, feel free to bring up the Nature Conservancy as much as you'd like. Here's my new take on the mainstream environmental movement, and tell me what you think about this. So basically, I can understand, if not agree with, an attempt to say, look, we're up against a lot here. We can't really expect to win all of the battles. So let's just take a very middle of the road approach. We're not going to upset anyone. We can get some legislation passed, and that's going to be the way forward. So that concept of, well, this is the only way to win anything. Don't be foolish by overplaying your hand. So, my response to that, to my own framing of this, is okay, that's nice. We tried that for how many decades? And how is that working? We're under the most unprecedented assault and onslaught on public lands, if we're just talking about public lands. But if we're talking about the unraveling of ecosystems, et cetera, it's only getting worse. We are getting our heads handed to us. Can we not accept the fact that we tried this strategy? It failed. And how about for the next 50 years or year, we try a different strategy? So, what would you say about that framing of things?
Yeah, I struggle with this all the time. Like, I don't know if there really is a mechanism for reform within these organizations to really start shifting that mindset, right? Of we have to play ball, we have to play nice, we have to preserve our access. We don't want to piss people off. Um, we don't want to alienate our contacts in the media. It just feels like this is a part of a larger pattern that's occurred over the last, I want to, 50 years or so under the neoliberal era, where back in the 60s and 70s, we had really strong and scrappy media outlets and nonprofit organizations that saw themselves as being critical to American democracy through their ability to question power, to provide a real check and balance. And it just feels like the media, the corporate media, and the big greens and the land management agencies are really working in concert, and members of Congress. It feels like they're all working together. And to steal a term from Noam Chomsky, he talks about manufacturing consent. So it's this it's this whole system that has failed us, that is failing us. And we're seeing that in corporate media now. I just saw that Jimmy Kimmel has been reinstated, and that came after probably some pretty big hits to Disney's pocketbook. I heard people were canceling their subscriptions, but so maybe money talks at the end of the day. I don't know exactly what happened there. I'll read about it later today. But so there was a mechanism for reform there, I suppose. But it just there's an unwillingness, it seems today, for whatever reason, and again, I'd like to hear your thoughts about this, where we just don't that big greens just don't want to fight like they used to. They don't want to upset people. They don't want to upset the apple cart. They're really unwilling to advocate in the same way that they used to. And again, this was probably when they were smaller and less complicated, but it just feels like this fusion of state and nonprofit and media conglomerates that are pushing the narrative, they're pushing the propaganda, and they make, you know, that they make people like you and I and the views that we might have appear to be unreasonable. And I think that's really disconcerting in many ways, because I feel like the views that conservationists might have, or those who are seeing the ecological and biodiversity crisis that we're experiencing now with clear eyes, that it's actually not unreasonable at all right now to be asking for the rest of our remaining wildlands to be protected to stave off this biodiversity crisis. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Well, yeah, I largely agree with what you're saying. And I would say, correct me if I'm wrong. I've asked this question of a lot of people and they haven't provided any examples. Point to me any other advocacy movement, whether it's on the left or the right or wherever, that intentionally chooses an extremely watered down perspective to advocate for. Like, I can't think of a one, whatever your take is on abortion, either side, they're pretty fierce and staunch. I think they expect in lawmaking that it's probably going to get watered down, but they realize our role is to push from this angle and push or pull or whatever. That's their job to advocate for it. That's what David Brower has always said. It's about maybe there will be a compromise proposed by somebody else, but we pull it in our direction. It's something to organize people around. So yeah, I think it's the only movement, particularly in terms of the not even just big green. I think the big green perspective has encompassed most of the environmental movement, not all of it, certainly, because of its influence. But if I were to trace it a little more as to what they're aligning with, you had mentioned media and land management agencies and certain members of Congress, et cetera, et cetera. While I'm no fan of Republicans and I've never voted Republican and I don't plan on, I stopped voting Democrat as well because I just see the big green mainstream environmental movement as just a proxy for the Democratic Party. And I know a lot of people listening, it's like, well, but they're better than the other side. It's like, okay, but not good enough. And in fact, right now, some of the biggest proponents of public lands logging are Democrats. They're my elected officials here in Colorado. They're Ron Wyden in Oregon. It's pretty much across the board. On these issues, they've become just as bad as Democrats, and they have more cover for doing so. So, what do you think about the idea that sounds conspiratorial? And I'd be open to pushback that they're kind of just a stand in for the Democratic Party, which wants to do environmentally things, but not too much, because then they'd have to take responsibility for what would look like radical change.
I think that's absolutely right. And I can't think of another example of a movement around a set of issues that just compromises so soon, like right out of the gate. And it's like, what are the real benefits there? Like, I haven't seen the benefits come forward. They're just not there. I see. I mean, I've got a list of bills of past bills and current proposals that show all these wilderness study area and roadless land releases. But this has been the status quo for a very long time. And it's like they're okay with this compromise initially, right? Like, we should be letting the politicians do the compromising, but as advocates, it's up to us to be speaking for what we see as right, for what we see as biologically and ecologically centered and justifiable. So it just becomes this really weird trading game, and I don't understand it. And like you said, I can't think of another of another area where this is so prevalent. It makes really no sense. I think until you start looking at it through that lens of really this is just an extension or almost an arm, a consensus mechanism of the Democratic Party itself, which is completely milquetoast, and they get away with murder essentially.
Yeah. And so, because this is a sensitive topic, because we're living in an age of Trump and people are saying, well, you guys are bad mouthing the Democrats. What do you want, Trump? Personally, my argument would be, well, that's why we have Trump, because there isn't an alternative of something that's actually standing for something that means something. And I would say the Democrats have a real opportunity to genuinely and legitimately advocate for the natural world, to be like, look, here's how we're different, instead of just pointing out what we hate about you. And the sick, sad thing is that right now, the Democrats' positions and a lot of big greens positions on public lands and logging is identical to the Trump's administration. So they both believe that wildfire is a reason to cut down unprecedented amounts of forest rather, that doing so will protect communities and will protect the forest from high severity wildfire, whatever other boogeyman that they're putting out there. And I'm actually writing a piece right now that is almost certainly going to get me in trouble. That is, I live in Boulder County. I live in literally adjacent to national forest up in the mountains, but we encompass Boulder, which is the most liberal town in America, according to many people who have done polls on such things. Voted 79% for Kamala Harris. It's just left central. And there was this recent event where it was all of these entities that you think would be on the front lines for protecting public lands, speaking out against Trump's onslaught of his executive order to increase timber production, the rollback of the Roadless Rule, the establishment of 112 million acres of emergency authorization logging, down across the board. So this is Boulder County. These are organizations that are these watershed groups, et cetera, et cetera. They had this talk where they laid out talking point after talking point that is identical to the Trump administration and full of disinformation. And this is happening in Boulder County, one of the darkest blue places in the country. And again, there are identical talking points. So they're greenwashing the Trump administration. There is almost no daylight in their positions. They'll claim it's different, right? But their positions are identical. So that was not a question. That was just a mini rant. But yeah, does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't. I mean, let's just take issue by issue. It shouldn't matter what the political party is. If the Republicans are supporting one thing, the Democrats another, just because one person holds a set of values or positions around a particular issue doesn't really, it shouldn't tie them to that party, um, but it's pretty evident that the science is being ignored across the board. So in this case, yes, absolutely. I mean, the Trump administration and the Republicans, the MAGA Republicans, and the mainstream Democrats virtually have the same position around wildfire, and like you like to call it, wildfire pretense logging. It's the same. So just that in and of itself doesn't raise red flags for me, but it does raise a lot of questions, because we know that there is this other position that's being ignored. So in this case, I guess it does raise some flags because we know that there's this other set of science out there that is actively being ignored. But just the politics in and of itself, that's not necessarily a complete red flag for me. I want to look at each issue by issue because there actually is a lot of overlap between mainstream Democrats and the Republican Party, including the MAGA uh, Republicans as well. And a lot of that has to do with a lot of the class issues that we're seeing today, and power, and the distribution of wealth and opportunity today. But no, it's a big problem, and these sentiments are reflected in the policies and the comments of the big green organizations. I did get to see today some comments by the Wilderness Society on the Roadless Rule, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit about the Roadless Rule in more detail, but they're asking for a compromise and a collaborative process, and they say verbatim that they would be okay with some logging to preclude or mitigate wildfire in and close to communities inside inventoried roadless areas. So they are publicly advocating for the release of some of these places. Now they say they want to bring in other unroaded areas that are currently not in the inventory to sort of offset that, but they're still parroting the same timber industry talking points that are really detrimental to the entire conversation about how we're wanting to shift focus away from backcountry logging and management, and then moving in more towards the community oriented hardening and defensible space conversation. So it's very counterproductive and confusing to the public.
Yeah, well said. And your organization, so Eco Integrity Alliance, Western Watersheds Project, John Muir Project, and Eco Advocates Northwest, we drafted a sign-on letter to, of course, oppose the rescinding of the roadless rule, which we think that's a foolish decision, but pointing out all of the existing loopholes that allowed logging for quite some time. And the Wilderness Society letter, ironically, did mention all of the times that logging has been able to occur. They're pointing it out as a good thing, basically, like, see, that we can still keep the roadless rule and still do plenty of logging. But our letter that we put out, it demanded more protections, pointing out also Colorado and Idaho roadless areas where they're cutting the crap out of it. We're currently dealing with our largest logging project in Colorado history in roadless areas. I actually found out about another one a little further north in Colorado that even I hadn't heard of because of this media blackout on this issue. But our letter got over 150 signers to it saying, don't roll back the roadless rule, but actually increase the protections. The Big Greens have put out a letter as well. Theirs got about 150 signatures too. So what was really interesting is that ours got similar support, of course, with more grassroots groups, et cetera, but some decent sized groups signed on as well. So I guess my question there is, do you think that in time, if the grassroots is able to unite more and put out maybe more of a clear direction and ask for what it actually wants, do you think that in time could shift the perspective and the position of these big green groups?
Absolutely. I just want to mention that I'm not officially representing myself in the capacity that I have at Western Watersheds Project for this conversation. So I just want to make sure I
Yes.
put that out there. But yeah, that letter that we sent around, it got a lot of interest, and just those loopholes are glaring. And the roadless report that the Friends of the Clearwater put together very clearly lays out the consequences of these loopholes, and that they're continuing to be exploited even today. So even if we maintain, like you mentioned, we maintain that status quo, these places are still under threat. So do we want a slow bleed? No. Do we want this expedited wholesale removal of protections? No, hell no, absolutely not. But we can talk about these things with the public, who I don't think is as dumb as many people make them out to be. I think we can explain that this rule is not perfect. It was a first good step. It highlighted roadless lands as being critically important to all these values that we hold dear, but it's not enough, and it's not working. And I think that the grassroots can come together and can start explaining these things to the public and start laying out a vision for what we'd want to see for our roadless lands and for other parts of our public lands right now. Because the status quo is not working. We need to draw lines on the map and around areas, and we need designations that are meaningful. The wilderness designation works for the most part. There are some loopholes in the Wilderness Act, but we know what we get with designated wilderness. It's generally respected by the agencies, and the public understands the wilderness designation. They also understand the national park designation. They understand the national monument designation, but you can also have wilderness overlays on top of monuments and on top of parks. So I think we need to start advocating for wilderness for our roadless lands. And the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act does just that. So your group and my group and others like the John Muir Project are also advocating for this redlined Roadless Area Conservation Act, which would close those loopholes. So that, that is one avenue, but it doesn't seem like it's getting much traction. But the other avenue is to continue advocating for these larger wilderness proposals that the big greens have not supported, by the way. The Wilderness Society has not supported the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, even though it would protect 23 million acres of roadless lands across the Northern Rockies. Why is that? I've actually asked a staff member there, and they told me that it's just not feasible. It's not politically feasible. Well, why isn't it politically feasible? Is it because you're not rallying support around this? Is because you're not tapping into your massive news or email lists and rallying around this thing? Like, there's just this lack of imagination, and I got to be careful what I say here, but it's we need inspiration right now, and the big greens just are not providing that. And I think the grassroots are going to have to start filling in and taking their place in that regard, because they're just unable or they're unwilling to do it for any number of reasons, many of which we've already discussed here.
Sure. Yeah, well said. And yeah, we want to maintain our relationships with folks across the environmental movement. I feel like when I talk to them, I'm pretty upfront about my organization believes that public lands should be, yeah, wilderness, but also biodiversity, watershed climate preserves. It's a big picture idea that's unlikely to happen all of a sudden, but it's something that can rally people around. There are some other organizations like, Wild Yak. They have a Forest Council. They have a climate refuge idea. There's folks in the Shawnee National Forest that want to have climate area. So those big picture views, NREPA, National Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, all of that are big picture ideas that are positive moving forward, can instill excitement and inspire people. And yeah, it's pretty astounding that they won't support these things. And again, I talk to them and I try not to be dickish. I'm just, thanks for this, would you consider this and why not? And that's usually where the conversation ends. And no matter how polite I'm being, it does strain the interactions. And I don't really want to be out there just, crapping on them all the time, but I want to be honest and I want to take a journalistic approach to, well, here's what they're promoting. Here is the reality of the landscape and the ecosystems and biodiversity crisis, et cetera. Do you really think that that's going to get us here? But one example I do want to give of them shifting sort of, kind of a little bit at least. So big greens, we're actually promoting biomass energies, particularly from forests, cut them down for electricity primarily, but other forms of energy. And there were a lot of grassroots groups around the country that were environmental groups, air groups, climate groups, environmental justice groups were like, does this really seem like a good idea, cutting down and burning up forests for energy? I know we want more renewable energy here, but is this really what you want to call renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera? We were demonized, we were villainized, we were called advocates for the coal industry. When I was living in Vermont, I was like almost literally the only person speaking up about this There was another person from an organization called Biofuel Watch, which was, that was good. It was me versus Bill McKibben, who is not a big green environmentalist, but I think is central to the mainstream environmental movement. And as much as I support a lot of the work he's done, he was the one saying biomass was good. He was cheerleading it. He helped create a facility. And who's going to win that battle? Who do you think won that battle? Well, we did actually get some big facilities beaten back. And then over time, over that next decade, not just saying us ourselves, but those who were dealing with this issue were able to convince the environmental movement as a whole, for the most part, including Bill McKibben, that maybe this isn't such a great idea. Now, have they made up for the damage that they've done during that time? I'm not sure. I certainly didn't get any apologies, but the big boat did shift. So how much of this maybe is just, it is a huge cruise ship. And of course, we're all in kayaks. We're like, look at us, we can turn to the right. And they're like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a great example of what happened in Vermont. And didn't Michael Moore put out a film about biomass?
So Michael Moore was the an executive producer of a film that director Jeff Gibbs put out,
Right.
critiquing
Jeff.
certain forms of energy, including bioenergy. And I was part of that film talking about specifically forest biomass in Vermont. Yeah.
So that seemed like a maybe part of the tipping point as well, on that issue. It's hard to say, I guess, but I think the grassroots has such an important role in um, proposing new ideas and then pushing really hard for them, trying to rally support and getting even just a few individuals who are really, really passionate about a particular issue to really go to bat. And it makes a difference. And that's how all change has happened, right? I mean, we don't drink mercury anymore. We wash our hands before we scrub down before doing surgery because we learned about these new things called microbes. And the early surgeons who would wash their hands, they got made fun of and harassed, and so these things have to undergo a process. But the grassroots and sort of the little chihuahua that's nipping at the heels of the big mastiff, um, it's important, and that's how you get these shifts. And without the grassroots, the whole system just isn't going to move. I think so. It's about holding groups accountable. With these issues, like you said, it's not just about, or it's really not at all about attacking or shitting on groups. It's about holding them accountable and encouraging them, but also, you know, moving forward with action to demonstrate that this issue actually is very popular among the public and people actually want this to happen. So if you don't come along, you're going to be left behind. And I think that's how they need to feel with these issues, because I know in my heart that most Americans would want to see these places sufficiently protected, but they're just not being reached, and they're also not being told the full story about what's going on behind the scenes, why we're at this point, and also why aren't the big greens advocating for wilderness protection. So I think that biomass uh, issue you raised is a great example, and I think we can do the same thing with some of these large visionary proposals, like these climate reserves, like NARIPA, like the America Red Rock Wilderness Act. There's so many bills that are kicking around right now that really could come together and bring some hope to the American people who are feeling really distraught and disenfranchised right now around public lands, not to mention, of course, pretty much every other issue under the sun.
Yeah. Yeah. It could be a leading of the way, and sort of like, hey, y'all, look, it is safe for us to go here. People will support sticking our necks out for the natural world. I do think a carrot and stick approach is always necessary. Maybe there should be a little bit of a stick there, but the way I see it more and more is the grassroots needs to create that better example. When right now it's good natured grandmothers, they donate their money to the Nature Conservancy or the Sierra Club or something like that. And maybe they haven't even heard of these other organizations. So creating some sort of coalition, more network, just tying together of like, well, here's the group that's in your area that you should support instead of them. Your $35 going to Sierra Club, sorry, is just going to be swallowed up into the behemoth. That $35 is going to pay for like an hour of somebody's work in the grassroots group. You'll actually get like a press release will be written from that $35, like actual things.
Right.
So showing this other way and then saying to Big Greens, hey, look, come along. We've carved out the route for you. So then you can take it over and dilute it and ruin it. No, I'm just kidding. But hopefully they would actually come along and realize that. So what about us as the advanced scouts?
Mm.
Does that make sense as an analogy?
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, I would say, not as part of like a greater coalition, I would say, but just as, as being members of this environmental movement or conservation movement, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, of the greater movement, but certainly not, with consensus going out and doing these things. I think we just have to do it and show the way and show what's possible, but also get people to start calling and emailing these organizations and their boards of directors and say, "Hey, I really don't appreciate what you're doing here, but here's a different approach. Here's something I would support." And I think that's really critical right now. I think members of these organizations need to start holding them accountable, picking up the phone, sending emails. I know that's been happening in Montana, and I would like to talk a bit about the Gallatin Forest Partnership and what's going on in the Gallatin Range there, because that's a very uh, hot button issue that is actively evolving.
Yeah, let's get right into that.
Sure. So I'm going to be releasing a 4-part series on the Gallatins on my podcast pretty soon. And then I'm going to be re releasing a film called The Wild Gallatins later this week, which talks about the Gallatin Range, its importance for wildlife, its proximity to Yellowstone National Park, some of the history to get it protected, and then also the big greens and some of the regional and state greens who have sort of marinated in this whole thing that we alluded to earlier. They're kind of taking on a lot of the flavors of the big green MO. But they are actively looking to release parts of the wilderness study area in the Gallatins and also some of the roadless lands and seed it to motorized and mechanized recreation. And people don't understand this. Like if you go to the websites of the Montana Wilderness Association now, Wild Montana or Greater Yellowstone Coalition or the Wilderness Society, or if you go to the Gallatin Forest Partnership's website, it looks like this, they present it as this no-brainer compromise for conservation and recreation. But unfortunately, they are looking to release, again, parts of this wilderness study area, which are some of the most critical wildlife habitats in the Gallatin Range. There are low-lying valleys, specifically the Porcupine and the Buffalo Horn drainages in the Gallatin Range. So they actually want to release this wilderness study area in the best wildlife habitat in the entire range. The Buffalo Horn, the Porcupine drainage, the upper part of it butts right up against Yellowstone. It literally shares a border with Yellowstone National Park. So these animals are migrating in and out. So it's this insatiable appetite for recreation, and the political pressures that come along with it have really compromised these groups, and they are actively promoting these harmful land protection rescissions and rollbacks, essentially. So, that's just one example. There's also the Lincoln Prosperity Proposal, which is introduced in about 2020 or so in Lincoln, Montana. It does include new wilderness, but it also has some roadless releases. There's, of course, the Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act in Montana. That passed out of committee in 2023. It's still alive. I mean, Tester lost his seat, but it's still alive. But that would release thousands of acres of the Montour North Blackfoot uninventoried roadless area, and would also create all these other designations such as recreation management areas. And this is supported by the Wilderness Society, the Montana Wildlife Federation, Pyramid Lumber, the Bob Marshall Wilderness Outfitters. Um, and there's all these other examples I could talk about. There's the Boulder White Clouds bill in Idaho in 2015. There were 4 wilderness study areas released there. About 155,000 acres of wilderness quality lands were released, and this bill was supported by the Idaho Conservation League out there. They're kind of a big green. They take on a lot of the flavor of the big greens. The 2014 Rocky Mountain Heritage Front Act had WSA and roadless releases. This was supported by the Montana Wilderness Society. I'm sorry, the Montana Wildlife Federation, the Wilderness Society, American Rivers, and the Nature Conservancy. And then it goes all the way back to like the Harry Reid bills in Nevada. He was famous for creating this quid pro quo wilderness bill, and the White Pine County Lands Bill, and the Lincoln County Conservation, Recreation, and Development Act all had these releases of lands for lesser protection in order to gain a little bit of wilderness. So, it's a big old mess, and it's a pattern that's been repeating over and over, and it continues today. So sorry for rambling there.
No, that wasn't rambling at all. That was journalistic reporting of facts. So thank you for giving some exact examples of the ways in which these influential, well-moneyed organizations are choosing to act as the arbiters of public lands, right? These lands belong to everyone. They've decided we'll make the decisions. Oh, do you want to hear what the public has to say? Not interested. It's upsetting. And this is factually what's happening. I've experienced it many, many a time. Just to add on a couple examples. So I'm also incriminated, and not just you, for speaking out. So out here in Colorado, I've been pretty outspoken about wildfire pretense logging. I kind of had to be the first one to speak out, but a lot more people are speaking out, including organizations, et cetera, et cetera. But I had put out some piece at some point, I don't remember, a couple of years ago, a few years ago, that was making some waves. It would have been nice to have the Wilderness Society supporting the Wilderness Society, supporting land protection. They could have maybe just kept their mouths shut. Instead, they put out a piece that I have to assume was in response, even though they didn't mention mine, or just a terrible coincidence, basically advocating for a certain more aggressive public lands management. And it's almost like, well, of course you're going to have more influence than I am. Just like the idea that they would see some grassroots advocates saying something like, we got to step in there. What, we're making them look bad? Like, what is the impetus behind that? And I would say perhaps the worst example, and this is more about cluelessness, but so I'm reluctant to name this just because I think the person was duped. So I'm not going to name the organization, but it's not that hard to figure it out. It's a state chapter of a big organization. They literally went onto public lands to cut down trees. They literally did. People are like, you don't know what the definition of literally is. I do. They were literally cutting down trees on public lands and advertising the whole thing as some sort of whatever nonsense. And I spoke to them like, do you know what you're cleaning up? They're basically cleaning up the mess of this previous fuel reduction logging project. I'm like, do you know what you're doing right now? You're covering up for what these folks, well, we'll look a little more into that. I haven't really heard from them since, but I also don't think they're doing those stupid field trips anymore. So that's how bad things have gotten. I really don't think the public knows about these controversies. Basically, how would they? Through media. Media, and I will be the first to say this, is covering up for the extraction industry and for Democrats, for the government, whatever, Republicans too, by not reporting accurately or at all on, certainly not in a balanced way, on these environmental issues. So people don't know about it. The only way they would maybe know about it is through independent media. Most of them don't have the wherewithal to actually report on this, or are also kind of like, well, we're on team blue, so let's not critique it because the Democrats support it. So we have social media, we have alternative independent media, and that's pretty much it. So most folks, unlike us, and even I'll say I'm a little bit, I wouldn't say the word is worried, but cautious when I talk about this. Most people don't want to say anything. Most people don't want to critique the other part of the environmental movement. It looks petty. It looks bitter. It looks like infighting. It looks like we're supporting the other side, whatever the heck. So what do you think about my premise of just like people are not even aware of these controversies and how the big greens are not necessarily doing what people think they are?
That's true. I mean, the media doesn't always cover these issues. And when they're presented with a story or another side of a story, they are oftentimes not covered. I will say, though, in Montana, I've been fairly impressed with the coverage of this Galton's issue. And that was in all part, because of grassroots organizing. There are a lot of people, particularly the old guard out there, who've been longtime wilderness advocates, who were early supporters and founders of these groups. They have connections, but the media, for the most part, has been covering this issue. So I have seen some good reporting, like in the Mountain Journal. George Ochinsky, I think is how you say his name. He writes a weekly column in like the Daily Montanan. That might be a different outlet. Um, I've seen some decent reporting in like Outside Bozeman, and it's had consequences for these organizations. People have been calling them and even dropping them out of their wills. You know, People are really upset about this, but they continue to march forward. They just introduced this draft bill, the Gallatin Yellowstone Conservation and Recreation Act, which I mentioned earlier. So they're still going forward with this thing, despite this opposition. So there's obviously a lot more work to be done around this, and I hope that my film can start to shed some more light on it. We had for the premiere of the film, we had a couple hundred people or so at the Museum of the Rockies show up in Bozeman, and I've had to re-upload the film a couple times, but it's had close to 100,000 views. So the message is getting out there. So I think we need to take a dual approach. We need to stay on the media, hold them accountable, ask that they report, and then at a minimum, they need to be publishing op-eds that counter the positions that their editorial staff is publishing, or staff writers. But we also need to be putting out independent media and podcasts and film and writing and making these phone calls, emails, informing our friends and neighbors about what's really happening and asking, is this actually what you want? Because this is the information that you're being told, and these are the facts as I see them. This is what I understand to be happening, and it's not what appears to be accurate.
Sure. Yeah, it's great where some media is definitely doing its job and a lot of it is falling through the cracks as well. Great to hear that's happening in Montana. I have a few theories about that, but I'll maybe mention that to you off the air so I don't keep beating a dead horse. But I've got one last question to ask you, and then I want to go into our final segment, our new segment, which was inspired in part by a discussion I had with you. But anyway, so you mentioned this earlier on, but we didn't really get much into it. Foundation funding. How central is that to the positions of Big Green? And let me just preempt that by saying Thank you to the foundations that fund Eco Integrity Alliance. We are very appreciative. And the truth of the matter is, the foundations that fund Eco Integrity Alliance are pretty small foundations. We've made it very clear from the start what our position is, and they have supported us for that. So our critique, I don't think, is going to be a concern. But clearly lots of foundations are doing good things. There's some foundations that are doing, I would say, excellent, almost entirely excellent things. But there's some other foundations out there that are a little iffy. So what do you think about that? Is it a conspiracy theory or what?
No, there's something going on there for sure. I mean, so some of these larger foundations seem to really like this collaboration and compromise model where they specifically want to fund these initiatives. So you find a bunch of willing participants who are, um, you know, who purport to represent a certain constituency, whether it's a particular form of recreation or a particular form of extraction, and they're willing to sit down. And a lot of times they're actually paid directly, by the Forest Service to participate in these collaboratives. But these foundations really like it because it takes a lot of the messiness out of the process. But then also there's this deliverable, right? If we have this consensus body who is going to basically put this proposal forward and say, hey, we've got it all figured out, hand it over to the politicians, say, we've done all the dirty work for you. We've got this neat package. All you have to do is rally support in Congress. Well, the fact is that these organizations don't necessarily represent all interests or even most people's interests, for instance, in the wilderness advocacy side or the wildlife advocacy side. Very, very rarely are wildlife specific interests ever invited to be at the seat at these tables. So it's, again, back to Chomsky, it's a manufacturing of consent, and it's very dangerous to our democracy, I believe, because it stifles dissent, it stifles debate, it stifles discourse, it pigeonholes people, it marginalizes people. One example that I wanted to mention earlier, it's not specific to foundations, but we'll get back to the foundations, is Dorothy Bradley, who is a 7-time Montana House representative. She joined the Montana House at age 23. She was the only woman. She might have been the first woman, actually. She was a Montana Democratic gubernatorial candidate, lost by a very small margin. But anyways, she was recently at a Greater Yellowstone Coalition or Wild Montana event. I forgot, it was one of those two organizations, or maybe it was just for the entire Gallatin Forest Partnership. And she was given the mic. She had some questions, and they actually turned her microphone off at this event because, I mean, that's very telling, right? I mean, they want to shut down debate and any dissenting opinions. But it's also very telling that what they're doing isn't, they're feeling the heat, right? It's not popular, obviously. So they're very sensitive around this issue. So that's just one example of sort of where these collaboratives can end up. That's how it can manifest itself in the real world, is you marginalize and you disenfranchise large parts of the population who do not feel represented by these processes at all. And yeah, then you get the Gallatin Forest Partnership pushing through this bill that is complete trash, and people are pissed off. And these are our public lands. Like, we're supposed to all have a say in what happens in these places. And when you have this group purporting to represent all of these elements and constituencies that clearly do not, you're going to get this backlash. You're going to get this backlash. So it's not working. The foundation, just small foundations that fund important work. You have large foundations that fund important work as well. But once you start handing out hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions of dollars, you become tied to these organizations, to these foundations, in ways that maybe don't seem apparent. It's either specifically mentioned or it's not mentioned, right? Kind of, we all sort of know what that feels like when there's expectations put upon us that aren't necessarily written down. We understand that there are certain strings attached. And, it can be very dangerous. It can derail an entire organization. It can shift the mission. It can render them ineffective. And in some cases, it can render them obsolete if the grassroots pulls in another direction and then they become irrelevant. So yeah, I mean, there are like the Ford Family Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trust. These are some of the larger organizations that are funding conservation work. I don't know how active Pew is anymore, but then also we've got like the big corporations like Patagonia now, who are putting their money behind certain initiatives. So I don't understand the full landscape, and I don't want to speak specifics about it, because honestly, I'm not really that well read up on it. But I've definitely heard a few things from folks who have interacted with some of these larger foundations, have been on boards, and but it's something I want to dive into and really start to understand exactly how their influence works.
Yeah. And I do think that there are philosophical differences. I do think that there is industry influence, but I also think a lot of it has to do with short-term deliverables versus a long-term victory. It looks better
Mm,
to say, look, we did a thing. We got 14 acres and gave up 140. Look, I got 14 rather than we're trying for 14,000 in 11
yep.
years.
Points on the scoreboard, right?
So unfortunately, that's the competitive nature of things. And even the foundations that I work with, they do want a yearly report, which of course they should. Here are the thing. So I point out mostly, I'm like, listen, here's a difference between our effort and our outcome. So here are the things that we did. And then here's the result of it. Just like keep in mind, we're going for a much more difficult goal. So, but it is a difficult way explain it. So a lot of entities are like, you need to give us deliverables. They're like, okay. And so this is what we're going to do. I also think that the concept of bringing a compromise together makes sense, but I think it's ill placed in an environmental situation where we've already had the majority of Earth's ecosystems destroyed, erased, or compromised. We're in this free fall. And it's like, well, let's keep finding a compromise. Let's keep finding a compromise. It's like, this isn't two identity groups seemingly across purpose trying to find some middle ground. That makes sense, right? It's like, okay, what is your thing that you want? What is your thing? We'll find a thing because this is something that we're just battling up against scientific limits, and there's just no room for any more compromises. But I will say, to sort of just wrap this up here, and certainly if you have any more thoughts before the last segment, happy to hear them. But when I first started doing environmental work around 2003, I was doing door to door canvassing for the Sierra Club. I mean, I'm like, they're the Sierra Club. They're good, I guess, right? And I think some of what they do is good. Anyway, so we did that. We brought in money. Who knows where that money went? It was a sort of weird thing. But anyway, then I started working with an organization out there that was smaller, but basically had that mainstream green philosophy. And it's like, basically, it was, let's advocate to protect some areas, but then let's actually advocate for logging other areas. And when I was doing door to door canvas, even though there was a little part of me, I was like, this seems weird. It was a lot easier for me to talk to people because
Mm.
I didn't have to say, we're doing this hard thing. People are going to be upset, and you might be upset. It's like, oh, don't worry. Cause I would always be like, oh, don't worry. We're also allowing. So psychologically, it's just easier for humans, particularly certain personalities that are high in agreeability where they don't like being seen as the bad guy. Does that make it all some sense? Just to understand where folks might be coming from. It's not just the money. It's definitely
Oh
the
yeah.
money, but not just the money.
No, I think that makes great sense. I mean, advocating for wildlife and wilderness in an uncompromising way is just inherently very uncomfortable because you're the one at the table who's saying no, no more. Um, and I think you hit the nail on the head. Like, this model doesn't fit the rest of our politics, just because we are already up against those limits. We are in that extinction crisis today. Only 2.7% of the lower 48 is in wilderness. And we have about 2.9% left, which is inventoried roadless in the lower 48. That was just kind of a quick back of the envelope calculation. I actually have to redo that. Um, but species are at risk right now, with our current, with the status quo. So we need to, so protecting what we have left should not be an extreme position. That it isn't even the minimum that we should be doing right now. And everybody should be behind that. Everybody. This should not be a politicized issue. Hunters and anglers should be all about this. I can't stand how hunters and anglers get pulled apart as a separate group from environmentalists, and then environmentalists get pulled apart from this. You know, I think I mentioned it earlier with you before, but it's like calling somebody a shelterist, right? It's like we all need shelter. So should we even be talking about, whether we need it or not, or whether this is like central to our identity? It's an inherent need, and we need these ecosystems to function, for us and just for the rights of nature for all these species that are out there. So to take an uncompromising position at this point is so minimal. It's so minimal. If you want to talk about extreme, then maybe half the United States should be rewilded, right? I mean that's sort of an extreme position potentially. But to just say that we should be protecting the remaining roadless lands and wildlands that we have left today, I mean that's insanity, and it's laughable on its face.
Totally agree. And I think for us to meet any sort of obligations under climate agreements or under the global biodiversity framework or that concept of half Earth, E.O. Wilson's idea and others as well, of having half of the planet protected as actual functional ecosystems. For that to happen, we have to protect public lands in its entirety. And to do that, we have to deal with the Trojan horse of wildfire logging. That's why I beat that horse into the ground. Well, sorry for wildlife advocates, but come up with a better analogy. But that's why, because that is that Trojan horse to undo all of that.
Yeah, same with livestock grazing.
Good point.
And as mining and oil and gas ramps up too, I don't know, that could be a major issue as well coming up
Yes.
in more and more places. But I see livestock raising as being right up there with this fire pretense logging. This all these Trojan horses that are out there.
100%. No,
Um,
absolutely. I mean, that's why we're advocating for no extraction. So, no logging, no grazing, no mining, no drilling on public lands. The idea that that's this weird fringe idea where even in groups of environmentalists, they're like, there's that guy who's actually advocating for protecting our land. Don't talk to him. It's like, what have we become?
yeah, I mean, I think a non-extreme position would be like 25% of our land base in some sort of permanent protection. And that would have to happen through public and private arrangements for sure. And of course, there's ways that we could be doing conservation better everywhere. But yeah, I mean, like, how are we going to get there if the big greens are still okay with trading away roadless and WSAs? And they're not speaking up when there's logging in these places too. We didn't even talk about that. We were just talking about releases as a part of these bills. Like, where are the big greens in Vermont with this telephone gap project, 1,800 acres in roadless lands? I mean, some of them are even supporting it. I don't want to get into trouble, but some of the organizations out there, I know they haven't opposed it, and some of them are actually in favor of logging. So there's still so far to go to even start to be thinking about rewilding and actually protecting additional areas when we can't even take care of what we've got under our care already.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. And while I do want to continue to critique the mainstream greens, I want to put more and more of my energy into here is the alternative that we want to have. Here are these big picture ideas that we want to put forth. And I think that's really the way forward. And hopefully Big Green figures that out over time. But yeah, I
I
really want
agree,
to.
but I think it's equally important to educate the public that what they are purporting to be doing may not necessarily align with reality, with with the things that they say that they want to accomplish. The things that they're actually doing are taking away from those efforts. And I think that's critically important. So I think we need to keep talking about that, but at the same time, we need to be putting proposals out there and rallying behind these visionary proposals to start getting us to where we want to go. Because if we don't explain, do the journalistic side of things, then people are going to be left even more confused. Like, wait, I thought we already had all these groups who are doing this work. So who are you? And so if you can kind of front load that and explain it, I think it's going to make the conversations a lot easier going forward.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Just saying that we do need all pieces of the puzzle. And I have in the past gotten caught up with just critiquing what these groups are doing wrong rather than proposing the better alternative. But I know your group is doing that. Many other groups are as well. It's a both and kind of thing. So
Hmm.
100%. That's why I wanted to have you on to talk about this. That's why we bring this up a lot on Green Root Podcast. And I've got a lot of people telling me chill out about it, but I do think it's important to discuss. And yeah, I really appreciate everything you're doing, all your excellent work. But I wanted to ask you about the last segment of the Green Root Podcast, which is newly implemented. So the premise of the podcast, of course, is we're uncovering the roots of the ecological crisis. And so I want to ask you, Adam, can you figure out, could you propose one route, just one of many, it doesn't have to be the route, a route of what you think our current ecological crisis might be?
This one's hard. I mean, I want to focus on the things that we can do today that are actually attainable, and but I don't want to dismiss the question either. You know what I mean? Like I feel like there's so many different things and different variables that are leading to our or that have led to and continue to perpetuate our ecological crises. Um, it's hard to pick really just one of them, but yeah, I'm sorry, I'm struggling. I mean, I could talk about population. Obviously, that's an issue. Um, Unfettered, unregulated capitalism is an issue. Uh, Demanding better and better lifestyles, but the thing is, like, these are inherent human trajectories. I believe. These are embedded and built into us. Like we want more comfortable lives. We're going to procreate. Um, we are you and I've had these discussions. Like we're sort of, I think we're embedded in this system of growth and exploitation that just feeds on itself. Nate Hagens calls it the superorganism. I don't know if you've listened to any of his stuff, the Great Simplification podcast, but we're all a part of this organism that's just chugging away and it's consuming and um, we're never not going to stop wanting to grow. So that's why I really like shifting the focus of this conversation towards what can we do today? Like what is within our power to do? And for me, that is to go back just to pretty much everything we talked about in this episode is to start drawing lines around roadless areas and say bulldozers, chainsaws, oil derricks, motorized recreation, mechanized recreation, you shall not pass. Like these places are for wildlife and for ecological processes. So these are things that we can do, we can choose to do as a society. I feel like the ecological crisis and all these other issues are so far out of our control We can tweak and do things around the margins. We can make personal choices in our lives. We can, and those make us feel good, sure. But ultimately, they're not going to solve what's coming. I feel like we've got, what some people refer to as the great filter. We have a massive population reduction and a reduction in our lifestyles coming for us. But what can we do today to protect habitat and species going into the future so that they might be able to survive this looming climate and ecological disaster that we are bringing upon ourselves? And again, I don't really think that we have much of a say in that. I think it's just embedded, and it's just the course of human history and human nature.
I think that was a great answer. That's a segment I don't comment on it. I just want to hear what people think. It's a tough question, and I think you answered that quite well. So, yeah, thank you, Adam, for coming on the Green Root podcast, for all your great work. Where can folks find how to get a hold of you, your organizations, your podcast, that new film
Sure.
re-release,
Yeah.
etc.?
Well, you can find me on Substack. So it's ourpubliclandspodcast.substack.com. And I'm also on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So that's where most people listen to my podcast. You can subscribe there, or you can subscribe on Substack, also get the podcast notifications. And I'll do a little bit of writing there as well. So that's where you can find me. My contact information is I give my email, which is contact@ourpubliclandspodcast.com. So that's offered up in the intro of all of my episodes. I should probably just put it in the show notes or something, but if people want to reach out to me, you can there. And the film will be released on Substack. I'm thinking maybe Friday. This coming Friday, it'll be released, so it's all ready to go. I just have to kind of put a little bit more text together and get it all packaged up and sent out. So if you subscribe to my Substack, you'll get it, or you could just find it on my Substack page. So, but yeah, this has been great, Josh. I didn't sleep all that well last night, so hopefully I made some sense today. I just kind of feel like my brain's a little bit mushy. So, but really, I really appreciate everything that you do, and yeah, thanks for this opportunity. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thank you.